Welcome to the fourth episode of the Whole Reason podcast, where I am endeavoring to create a community where we pursue spiritual and intellectual maturity, right? We don't want to be Christians who don't use our minds, nor do we want to be people who are merely intellects that have not developed our spirit. I've changed my camera setup today so you can see I'm overlapping myself a little, but that's okay. Watch this. Boink. All right, there we go. Now I'm tiny, and there's our slideshow. So let's just move right in. This week, we're going to be talking about applying the methods of reason to faith. Now, here's our overview for today. We're going to talk about a little bit about last week. We're going to spend about 10 minutes on today's topic. We're going to talk about a book of the week. We'll have a closing prayer, and then we'll talk about confessions of a podcaster, all the fun struggles that I have doing this. For those of you who are wanting to do your own podcast or thinking about it, you can join me on this creative and crazy journey. All right. So as you may recall, we were examining this epistemological tetrahedron. Sorry, big words are so much fun sometimes. So, but we talked about that in this pyramid of four different ways that the four methods we have for finding what is true. We have empiricism, which is basically what science does, experimentation and observation in real time, right? Now that works really well for material things that we can observe and test, but it doesn't work well for things we can't observe, like history. Now we do have data and physical artifacts and things like that from the past, but in that case, we can't observe what actually happened. For instance, if a murder happened, we didn't observe it, but we can still try to figure out who did it and why it happened, things like that. And that is where reason comes into play, where we start putting together the pieces of data that we do have, and we try to draw the best conclusions, even though we didn't directly observe what we saw. And of course, in the future, we'll talk about the role of experience, that is our intuition and conscience, in determining what is true, especially spiritual truth, which is not going to be so easy to prove with empiricism, although reason, as we'll see today, is really helpful in applying it to our own search for truth. Now, last week, the podcast was provocatively named "Reason is the Devil's Whore." And of course, that is a quote from Martin Luther, whose main argument was that reason unattached from faith can lead you to really bad conclusions. And he was also decrying the Aristotelian and Platonic influence in Christian doctrine, which was teaching things that the Bible didn't teach, like the natural immortality of the soul or things like that. So I was a little hard on reason last week and the application of reason and faith, not because it isn't a main feature of Christian approaches to faith, but because it has its place, right? And if we don't keep these methods in a proper relationship with each other, we can go way off course in trying to find truth. And it's a human tendency to use reason to want to disprove God and draw conclusions that are incorrect. And of course, as we said, when faith, that is when, faith and science disagree, one or both of them can be wrong, and it's not always the one you think. All right, well, we'll talk about that many times again in the future. But today I just wanted to talk about the main methods of reason. If you're a Christian, you need to know how reason works and how you can apply it to strengthen your faith, to refine your faith, to get rid of bad ideas or bad doctrines that are really not true, right? None of us has perfect theology, but we strive to make our theology match reality, right? That's where we're living in with a real God in a real spiritual world, not just something that we can separate from reality and say, well, it doesn't matter if it doesn't match. No, it does matter. It does matter. So let's look at a couple things here, shall we? Okay. There are three main methods of reason, and I want to talk about them today and how we apply them to our faith. So these three are inference, pragmatics, and integration. I know those are big words, but stay with me and we'll all learn together. All right. So inference Basically, the main type of logic is like when we use when we're solving a crime. Like let's say we're solving a murder, right? There's three. Well, let's just talk about two main methods. The first is deduction. Now, in deduction, we start with a general premise or principles, and we assume that they're going to hold for this case. We haven't looked at the evidence yet. There's no evidence here. We're not starting with evidence. We're starting with some general principles about how things usually work. And we'll work through an example or two to understand this. Now, the second type of logic is what we call abduction or induction. Now, the abduction and induction are not exactly the same, but we're grouping them together for simplicity's sake. And that is that they both start with evidence. They start with the evidence. We don't start with what normally is true, the normal principles. We just say, let's just start with the evidence and not assume we know anything about what has happened here or how things normally work. And then we're going to take all the evidence and infer the simplest, most probable solution. And that's sometimes referred to as Occam's razor or the inference to the best explanation. And in a future episode, we will talk a little bit more about Occam's razor, but not today. All right, because you can only do so much, right? All right, so let's go through an example. Let's say we've got a spouse who's been murdered. Well, deduction would approach it this way, not starting with evidence, but starting with principles. Well, we know that normally the most likely killer is usually the spouse. We know the spouse, and now we're going to start bringing in evidence. The spouse was at the scene at the time of the murder, and the spouse just learned that they are getting divorced. Well, that evidence doesn't prove at all that the spouse did it. But what's happening here is we're starting with general principle to lead us in the right direction. Now we're going to see if the actual physical evidence supports that. Now, that's not a bad way to do that, except that you may be excluding the real killer if you go down this avenue too quickly and realize, that they also have a son who's been in and out of jail, and maybe he just got out of jail last week, right? So you have to be careful about starting with principles and then drawing conclusions too quickly. So let's look at induction. So with induction, we would start with specific evidence. The spouse's DNA is on the murder weapon, and the couple just had a loud fight. Now, that still doesn't prove anything, but now we're starting with evidence, hard evidence that says, well, it's pointing in a certain direction. It wasn't the son's DNA. It wasn't the neighbor's DNA. We have this on the murder weapon. We know this is the murder weapon. So that's the difference between deduction and induction. One starts with principles and then tries to get to conclusions. The other one starts with evidence and then tries to go to conclusions. Now, that's kind of important, and we'll show how that works in a minute. So let's talk about an example of creation. The existence of life and of the universe itself. Can God ever be the most likely answer? Right? This is something I discuss with atheists all the time, and a lot of times they'll quote Richard Dawkins saying, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And to some extent, I agree. If you're claiming that a miracle occurred, and miracles are pretty unlikely, then you better have some really good evidence. So let's look at how we might apply this to the creation of the universe. So let's say we're going to talk about intelligence. So here's the evidence we would start from. And we're going to use abduction here, or we're going to start with evidence. We're not going to start with principles of how likely is it that God does things or whatever. We're just starting with the evidence. So here is how an intelligent design advocate would approach this. They would say, we start with the observation, the evidence that complex functional systems of information only come from intelligence, right? They're not starting with the Bible says and then deducing from that. If the Bible is true, therefore God exists or God created things. No, that's creation science, which is not a bad way to approach it. But again, that's deduction. Here with induction, we're saying what we observe is that complex functional systems of information only come from intelligence. Our conclusion then is that life and DNA had to have an intelligent source. Now we can go on from there to define what would that intelligent source be like. Is it God? Is it aliens? Is it some other intelligence that we haven't described yet? All right, well, let's look at perhaps the evolutionary approach where we say, unfortunately, we're starting with the assumption that only natural processes exist and not supernatural intelligence. But that's okay. I don't want to start with deduction. Let's look for the evidence. Unfortunately, the evidence is that we have never seen life come from non-life. That's abiogenesis. I know that's not quite evolution, but that is the kind of only starting place that we know that we have suggested so far, unless you say aliens invented life and seeded the earth, but then you still have the same problem as where did the aliens come from? So that it's the same. You have to have abiogenesis in the naturalistic explanation, as far as I know. All right. So we would say that, and complex proteins have never been observed to arise from mutation and natural selection. Now, I know that's a contentious argument, and we'll talk about that in a future podcast, because I'm of the mind that recent DNA and protein evidence is growing and growing that evolution is not able to produce the complex set of instructions that we need. And even within the scientific community, there's a call for a new Darwinian synthesis, because even one we have now has too many issues. There's some missing biological or some other natural process, because the current model is not able to create the complexity we see. So their conclusion has to be, from the lack of evidence, we are still looking for a possible mechanism. So this is the way I would use induction in answering the question of creation, and is there an intelligent creator or not? Now, I'm sure we could spend all day arguing through this, but I'm just giving an example. So let's try another example. Let's talk about the resurrection of Jesus. This is really fun. Let's say, here's the evidence we have. That, as far as we know, the disciples all believed so much that they became martyrs. They died for the faith. The Apostle Paul, who was an antagonist, was later converted. There's no physical body of Jesus that we know about. We do know that in history, a man named Jesus was crucified in Rome. His skeptical family was converted, and it seems as if there was an empty tomb. So we could look for natural explanations for that, or we could look for supernatural. Now, the supernatural answer is that a singular thing answers all those facts, and that is that Jesus rose from the dead. Even though that is a miraculous solution, it's actually perhaps more plausible than the naturalistic explanation. Well, how could that be? How could a miracle ever be more likely than natural solutions? Well, let's look at the proposed natural solutions. The natural solutions, now we know that the evidence is we see people who die for their faith often. Well, that might explain the disciples, maybe not all 12. So really what we have to assume is at least 3 natural processes all have to be true to explain the resurrection. And those would be that there was mass hallucinations, that people who thought they saw Jesus saw somebody else who they thought was Jesus, his twin brother or something. That there was a conspiracy that the disciples all knew that he had died, but they decided to carry it forward anyway out of devotion of some sort. And that the legends about Jesus and all the stories of all those things that happened, the miracles and all that, are pretty much made up, including the stories of his resurrection. So again, here we're looking, what is the most likely explanation? Now, in this case, it's argued, and I'll show you a book in a minute, it's argued that it is less likely that all of these naturalistic things can have happened in coordination than it is that one thing happened, and that is that Jesus actually rose from the dead. Now, there's a great book on this, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. It's not going to convert everybody, but it's a great kind of a logical approach to the best explanation for the things that we know are true. And here's what Gary Habermas said in that book. Although natural causes should be considered first, a supernatural cause may be considered when all natural theories fail. And there is credible evidence in favor of divine intervention. True, we should be careful that this does not become a God of the gap solution where God becomes the default answer whenever we cannot think of something else. Nevertheless, when the facts seem to point strongly to the divine and all natural explanations appear highly improbable, a supernatural explanation should be strongly considered. And I like how he is not overstating his case there. He just says it should be strongly considered, and that's how we approach this particular thing with inference. Remember, we're talking about inference. So that's inference. We're either using induction or deduction to find out what is true in the case where we're looking at history or things that we can't directly observe, right? If we could directly observe them, we'd be using empiricism. Now we're using reason and history falls into this category, as well as philosophical truth. Now let's talk about another. This is really fascinating, and I love this. Pragmatics. Now, what pragmatics is how well does it work? Right? So here's a definition of pragmatics. An ideology, it says that an idea or a proposition is true if it works satisfactorily. That the meaning of a proposition is to be found in the practical consequences of accepting it, and that unpractical ideas are to be rejected. So what he's saying here is, well, you can't prove that being kind to your enemies is true. You can't prove it, but you can look at the results if you apply that. All right. And maybe the way you apply it doesn't work. And then you would say, then the way I believe this and understand this is untrue. So here's Jesus talking about that one way you can test teachings is by the fruits of what they produce. Look at this. Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? In other words, can a thistle produce delicious fruit? Even so, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. All right. In Luke, it says, wisdom is justified by her children. In other words, if what you believe is really wise and true, what it produces, its children, are good things. Now, here's how I would here's how I would define pragmatics. Whatever leads to life and health is good and true. That which does not is evil and false. So the way pragmatics works, and we'll have an example, is we just say, if my view of the world leads to life and health, then what I believe is good and true. If my beliefs about the world do not work, let's say I believe that if I throw salt in my yard, it will help the grass. Right? And I throw salt in my yard and all my grass dies. Well, I think that's a good indication that my idea of throwing salt out there is not how the life and health of grass really works. Now, this also works in spiritual matters, right? This is why Pascal's wager, he said, look, you don't even have to believe. If you practice Christian perspectives and principles, you will see that they lead to life. They work, and therefore they are true. Now, there's a lot of question about how we define what works, and I'm just going to say for now, this is how I define when we're looking at spiritual truths, what works. If it leads to life and health, it's good. If it doesn't, then you better question it. All right. And life and health doesn't mean that people won't persecute you. If people persecute you for the truth, that doesn't mean it's untrue. All right. That's a whole separate definition or refinement, and we can talk about that another day. But let's keep going here, because there's a third type of use of reason, which is integration. So sometimes it's called confirmation holism. I don't know what that means. It's a big word, but just in case you see that in your reading. Now, this guy here, W.V. Quine, was a very influential atheist philosopher. I like some of his contribution to philosophy. Now, here's his complicated way of explaining or supporting the idea of integration. And don't worry, I'll give us a simple definition in a minute. But I want you to see that even atheists have practiced this method of defining what is true. If it integrates with the other disciplines of knowledge, then it's more likely to be true. If it doesn't integrate with our other disciplines, because remember, all of reality is integrated. It's one reality. So if I believe this in this area, but the principles don't integrate or don't work in other areas, it probably is not part of reality. I haven't integrated my view of reality yet. Something is wrong here. So here's what he says. And forgive me for putting such a weird quote in here, but I do like W.V. Quine. Our statements about the external world face the tribunal, right, the test of sense experience, not individually. So it's not just that they stand on their own, but only as a corporate body. All right, we have to integrate all of our thinking into a bigger system. Total science is like a field of force whose boundary conditions are experience. Okay, that's a little out there, WV. A conflict with experience at the periphery occasions readjustments in the interior of the field. So what he's saying is, if you say this is true in this area, but then you try to integrate it with the rest of what you know to be true in other areas, and it's not working, your experience is telling you that something is off about this, if this has to stand on its own and it can't be integrated into your worldview, there's something wrong. Now he says truth values have to be redistributed over some of our statements. In other words, the truth has to cover, it has to be integrated across all the things we believe. Reevaluation of some statements entails reevaluation of others because of their logical interconnections, the logical interconnections of truth, right? So if you're trying to find out what's spiritually true, you also need to think about how does this integrate into my understanding of humanity, about how we deal with justice and mercy. How do these things integrate with my beliefs in science? Are they, and if they're discontinuous, then something is wrong. All right. Well, let me give you my simple definition. If an idea is true, it will integrate with other established disciplines of knowledge. If it integrates poorly or integrates with ideas that have negative outcomes in real life, it is most likely untrue. So that's the other side of it. If my pet theology integrates really well with other ideologies that we know suck, like racism or eugenics or other ideologies that say they're doing something good, but we know that they're doing something bad. Maybe this other thing I believe is because it's in that company and it integrates well is not true. So let's give an example. And this is okay. So those are the three: inference, pragmatics, and integration. Did I have an example here? I don't think I did. I think I left it out. Let me go back here and see if I have notes on that to that effect. All right, well, I'll skip that and make it short for today. I'm sorry, but actually, let me give you one off the top of my head. Let's talk about Darwinian evolution. Now, one of the applications of it outside of science is what we historically know as social Darwinism, right? That is that the survival of the fittest also applies to society. And then that logically went to the idea that certain races are inferior, and it supported eugenics that says we should kill off the weak to make sure that the human gene pool stays healthy. Now, the problem is now we've learned, even though scientists and society was very excited about eugenics at first, Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, of course, was infamous for her desire to kill off the weak to help, and abortion was part of killing off the poor and those who are perhaps poor because they are not as intelligent. That was kind of some of her reasoning. So here we have these ideologies, social Darwinism and eugenics and racism, and Darwinism that we try to apply in science seems to integrate really well and applied in other arenas turns out to have these terrible results. Now, does that mean, can we do that? Can we say that evolution is untrue because it integrates with these more heinous ideologies? And I think that is part of the evidence that we need to reconsider when we look at evolution. If we can't prove or disprove it over here, well, how does it integrate with other belief systems, right? It integrates well with atheism, although there are theistic evolutionists, but it integrates really well with these other views. And if we think these other views are false, why do we think that Darwinism is true? Now, that's a whole nother ball of wax, and we'll talk about that. As you can tell, I'm an intelligent design advocate, but that is one way. Now, that doesn't mean that evolution is not true, but it is some evidence against it, right? Now, we need to take more direct evidence and look at, what it proposes, like junk DNA or vestigial organs and some of its other predictions, and go, well, that doesn't seem to work out even in science. We'll do that another day. So if an idea is true, it integrates well. So those are the three methods of reason, and we'll talk more in the future about this. Actually, let me see. All right. Okay, now here we are at the recommended books section of the thing, and I just want to say that I recommended this book last week, and I'm going to recommend it again. This tremendous audiobook is part of the Great Courses, and if you're interested in faith and reason, this is worth multiple listens, even though it's like 24 hours long or some crazy thing. And let's look at the description again. Are philosophy and reason and religious reason fundamentally at odds? They have a little misspelling there. From today's strict division between questions of logic and questions of belief, one might think so, but for 1,000 years during a pivotal era of Western thought, reason and faith went hand in hand in the search for answers to the most profound issues investigated by Christianity's most committed scholars. Right? So when we look at recent history, pre-modern history, there's a lot to be said about how Christianity and its emphasis on reason gave rise to what we successfully experience today. All right, and if you hit this other QR code on the right, you can actually join me on Goodreads, where we can share which books we read together. All right, and you can always go back and get that later. All right, so here's our tetrahedron again. That's another more information on how we use reason as Christians to find truth. We can't just use empiricism, especially since science only deals with what is material, and things like the existence of God and objective morals are not material. And so empiricism, although it can be used, has to take a backseat to reason, and as we'll see, perhaps even a backseat to experience and the authority of Scripture. And we'll talk about why we can trust Scripture and why we can't. All right, I'm just going to do a closing prayer, and then after this, we'll talk about confessions of a podcaster and things that I have endured as trying to get this fun thing off the ground. All right, let me pray. God, I thank you that you do allow us to employ reason, and that you correct our poor thinking, and that our wisdom is so poor compared to the wisdom that you have. Grant us your wisdom, your perspective. Help us to have integrity when we use reason and not just make weird, specious, illogical arguments, but that we clearly and honestly examine our faith and what we believe, so that we may discard superstition and have real faith, so that we may discard illusions and see things as they really are. Amen. All right, well, thank you. And if you're willing to stay to hear my confessions, we'll do that. So let's talk about that. This is not the Confessions of Augustine. But so here's what I've learned. And you know what? I saved all those things. Like, I wrote them down, and now they're not on the slide. That is just the weirdest thing. Oh, there it is. Okay. So, sorry, my wife told me not to talk about like the back of the seams thing. I'm doing like pushing buttons and stuff. But I should just like pretend I'm right on it. So anyway, here's some things I want to talk about, fellow podcasters. The first is that I need better lighting. You know, I discarded the green screen that I had, even though I like that gray wood background I had, just because it's such a hassle to get up the screen, and I have to light it anyway. So I thought, well, why don't I just use the lighting and light up my office? So that's what I did today. The lighting still kind of sucks. You know what I need is like some soft lighting with a cool lamp in the background, and you know, like my cat is over here sitting in the basket. It would be nice if the cat was in the picture. I mean, he's part of the deal here, right? So what I'm showing here on the screen is just an example of what the lighting ought to be. Let's make me a little bigger here so it feels a little more personal. All right. You can see a little bit of my real background. There's a beautiful watercolor it's called Bookends, and there's actually two cats looking out the window. You can also see there's a little cat carved thing looking over the edge, and a carved bird, a little bird next to him. You can't really tell, but that's what it is. So this is my office, and I'm just going to make it look better. This weird bright light over here, you know, it still puts shadows on my face. So lighting and podcast, and I need to get some of my expert friends to help me. This week, instead of using the camera built into StreamYard, I'm using my webcam. But instead of using the StreamYard option directly from my webcam, I'm doing it through an OBS window. So I'm running OBS over another one, and that allowed me to trim and zoom the picture, because you can't do that in StreamYard. So I don't want you to see my kitchen, right? And so I did that this week. So that was like an improvement, but it's still like I'm still like I got to get out of the way. I guess I got to sit way the heck over here, which should be off to the side of my monitor. Maybe that's a better idea, right? I'm still thinking about upgrading my graphics card to a newer NVIDIA card so I can use that cool technology where it makes it look like I'm always looking at the camera, even when I'm looking down at my notes and stuff. That might be creepy, but we'll see how that works. Um, I still haven't gone back to my other podcasts and added chapters. I actually learned that you can go into the description and you can put in timestamps for when you want the little dividers to be in your video. So I haven't done that yet. That's still on my back burner. I'm still only broadcasting live to YouTube because the free version of StreamYard only goes to one platform. I can do multiple platforms through this, and I'm going to try another piece of software that a buddy of mine recommended. I can't remember what it's called. So I'm going to be doing that. I'm still wanting to make this more engaging and more fun. Like I've got, I don't know how to announce it in a time period or prompt people to actually come on live and chat and all that with me. I haven't figured that out yet. Maybe I don't announce it or promote it at the right times or in the right venues. So, man, there's like a million things to think about, right? If you want to reach a bigger audience. I'm still wanting to structure the content in a way that is not only engaging, but attractive. When I was looking into doing online courses, one of the methods they tell you to use is that you need to have a promise transformation and over deliver on that promise, right? So if you watch this video, you can make $10,000 in the first month. Okay, well, I'm not doing that. But you get the idea. So I still want to change my content to be like, less purely academic and more engaging and applicable. I just haven't figured that out. But I do know that I'm going to do what I love to do, and the weirdos that's like it will come and we'll hang out together. I still need to be provocative. I wasn't that provocative this week. The content wasn't as exciting as reason is the devil's whore. Yeah. Anyway, but like a sermon, I'm still asking myself, what is the one truth I want people to learn, and what is the one action I want them to take? And I haven't been doing that with this yet. That's how I structure sermons, but this is not a sermon. This is something different, but that rule may still apply. So those are all the things that are going on in my brain. I'm still only on one platform. I'm not promoting the way I want to. I'm trying to get better engagement. I'm trying to hone my content so that it's not too broad or too hard to understand. So anyway, thank you for hanging out with me today. That's the end of my 4. Hey, look, I did 4. Okay. I'm jamming here. As long as I can do one every Saturday, eventually we'll build a community and I'll get really good at this. All right. Talk to you soon.